Dr. Rabbi Tzemah Yoreh is our biblical scholar in residence at Bruchim and is a member of our Rabbinic Advisory Council also, so a dual role in Bruchim. He has a pulpit. He's leader of the city congregation in New York City. He's also one of the intellectual leaders of Jewish humanism and has just told us he's also involved in the Reconstructionist movement. So he's a dual member of both of those associations. As I said, his newest book is Why Abraham Murdered Isaac, The First Stories of the Bible Revealed, which came out last year. He was a student of the Bible even as a child. He won the diaspora division of the International Bible Contest while he was a kid. He attended Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he obtained his Ph.D. in biblical criticism in record time, and earned a second Ph.D. in ancient wisdom literature at the University of Toronto just for the joy of studying ancient text. So we have a wonderfully intellectual and imaginative guest, and we are just thrilled to have him. So welcome, Rabbi Yoreh.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I'm thrilled to be here. This organization deeply aligns with my values, and I'm always thrilled to talk about why Abraham murdered Isaac. I've been talking about this actually more than half my life now. As of last year, I started talking about it at the World Congress for Jewish Studies back in, I believe it was 2000. So that was the first time I gave a lecture on this topic. So then I was an MA student, a graduate student at Hebrew University, and I'm still lecturing about this topic, and I'm still writing about it. It's a topic that interests me greatly. I'm hoping to connect this topic in the end to probably the last third of the lecture, the last third of the talk, to the idea of circumcision, because I think I'm going to tie it to chapter 17 in Genesis, and I was asked to do that by Bruchim, obviously, but I think that there's actually quite a bit to be said. There is I think a relationship between chapter 17 in Genesis, the chapter that commands circumcision in the book of Genesis, and chapter 22, where Abraham either binds or murders Isaac, depending on the version of the text. So let me start with the title. Yes, Why Abraham Murdered Isaac. Very provocative title. It's meant to draw people in, obviously. But it also, there's a reason I said that. I could have said why Abraham killed Isaac. The reason I say why Abraham murdered Isaac was because I was adopting a moral position on this, meaning, and that's the same thing that we're doing in this organization. In Bruchim, we're adopting a moral position that we should be welcoming people, based on, regardless of their choice on circumcising infants. And so I think that from the perspective of a modern reader who sees the Hebrew Bible as a book of characters rather than a historic book of telling history, a book of myth, that from that perspective, it's murder. It's not killing. If somebody in a modern court said they heard voices and they were told to bring a child to a mountain and then killed that child, they would be in jail for life in most societies, or they would be on death row. It's a moral position, and that's part of the reason for this title. Okay, so why do I ask the question? Why do I use that title. It's because the answer is, I could say, why did Abraham bind Isaac, or the question remains, why was Abraham put into that situation, period? And that's a question that people have been trying to answer, I would say, since the biblical text has been written onwards until the 21st century. It's not a question that has been resolved very well in my mind. And you see, like, really top world thinkers going at that issue. Kierkegaard and his Fear and Trembling and such. Really, Derrida. Really, people.
Tzemach, you're muted. You're muted.
Sorry, I did that by accident. I
Okay.
apologize. You
Sorry. Where did I get to? What was the last thing I said?
Derrida.
Derrida.
Okay. Oh, I said something about Derrida. Okay. So I was just going to say that if you have questions throughout, please put them in the chat. I find it hard to look at the chat while I'm talking, but I will also give opportunities. I'll take short breaks every few minutes for people to ask questions and to engage. Since I want this to be interactive, I do much better with interaction. I get nervous when I talk for too long and somebody doesn't ask a question. I feel that I'm saying something wrong. So I'm going to give plenty of opportunity, and but also just feel free, if you don't want to talk, to put the question in the chat, or I'll try to relate to it as well. So I'll start right away, like just on these few minutes. Are there any questions that arise? Where can we get your older books? My older books are in print. You can get them on Amazon.com. Amazon, unfortunately for authors, is a necessary evil, and all my books are there. I wish it weren't so, but it is so. So yeah, I can give you recommendations on what to read based on particular interests. You're always welcome to ask me. Okay, so just a little bit about. I'm going to start with an introduction to, like, a very short introduction to biblical criticism, because I'm not going to assume familiarity with notions of biblical criticism. So very basically, biblical criticism assumes that human beings, multiple human beings, wrote the Torah and wrote the Bible at large. They don't really go into the question of divine inspiration. That's not a topic that is, a topic is, the writing, and we leave the religious beliefs to the theologians. That's what a Bible critic does. And I was trained as a Bible critic. That was my first and primary training at Hebrew University. And so basically, there's an assumption that the Torah was written by multiple human beings at different times, and there have been varying theories on the process of that composition. The two competing theories these days are the documentary hypothesis and this supplementary hypothesis, and versions of each of those. So documentary hypothesis assumes four independent authors, four independent documents that were brought together by a series of editors at different times and are turned into the text that we have today. And the supplementary hypothesis, of which I am an adherent, has this idea of a base text that was added to, and so that there's one story that was added to and added to again and added to again, and it's a process of accretion rather than mashing together of documents. And I'm sorry, sometimes my bias against the documentary hypothesis will leak through because I have been this has been my way of thinking for the past 23 years. So I really I try to be objective about it, but I can't help bash the documentary hypothesis when I talk often. So just I'm sorry for that, for people who accept that theory as the one of biblical writing. Okay, so basically, what I've spent a lot of my time as a scholar doing is researching, finding out what the original stories said. What was the first source? What did it say first? The first literary source in Torah, especially, but also outside of Torah. And that's what I wrote my doctorate on at Hebrew University. And then I went through a very painful process for somebody who was trained as an academic in trying to popularize a book, because I'm very used to academic jargon and ideas and make all kinds of assumptions of knowledge, and it's really hard to do, as an academic, to divest oneself of that way of thinking. And so actually writing Why Abraham Murdered Isaac took me longer than writing either of my doctorates. Which seems fairly absurd, because it's an unfootnoted work and it's written in an entirely popular register. But it was a painful process for me and very difficult to write. It was much more difficult. I'm what they term an academic brat. Both my parents are professors, and I just grew up on academic jargon, and I went straight. Once I started my first year in the Hebrew Bible, it was assumed that I would be getting my Ph.D. I didn't have any doubts in my mind from about age 18 on this matter. So I was just, it was just really that way of expression was very natural to me, and that was why this book was hard for me to write. And so it went through multiple edits and versions. You can see some of those versions. I published some of those versions, the previous versions of this work. Anyway, so I spent my scholarly life isolating this first story, and specifically, one of the stories that got me started was this story of Isaac. Of Abraham and Isaac, and the first thing, I have a distinct memory of this. When I was, I think when I was about 20, of just discovering for myself that what I thought was the first version of the story of chapter 22 in Genesis, where Isaac is found, that I felt that the primary version was that Isaac was killed or murdered. And I remember feeling it very deeply, and like really kind of, it's like an undercutting of things that you grew up on. I grew up in a fairly religious home, and it was really difficult for me. I remember just like, kind of, my parents can attest, my parents still remember me just wandering around the house saying, wow, like, what is this? And so it was really, but I really wasn't the first to discover that, story. Meaning, there's a whole book called The Last Trial by Shalom Spiegel, which talks about the early rabbis who had that version of the story in their retellings, and kind of illustrates the early midrash around the early post-biblical expansions around this story. And there's a whole vital tradition around this, the tradition that enters liturgical poetry, and it's fascinating. And also, the reason it happened then in particular seems to have to do with the advent of early Christianity and story of the Passion of Christ. First, the literary version of Jesus was influenced by the story of the binding of Isaac, but then the story of the Passion then influenced the retellings of the story of the binding of Isaac. Meaning, it was a it was a back and forth actually. So that is a subject for another talk altogether. But anyway, so I just wasn't the first to come up with that idea. So really, my next step was to try to find out why, and that's where that's what's stumped so many people, and that's what's led to like books like Fear and Trembling or Gary Dawes' interaction with Dr. Kidau, where they just could not fathom a deity asking Abraham to do this. And so I, who am a skeptic by nature, found it a bit easier. And really, the way what I tried to do was tie it to earlier parts of the story. I tried to look at what it said, prior to Genesis 22. The story did not start in Genesis 22. In fact, the first words of Genesis 22 are, "and after these words," or "after these things." So something happened before to lead to God testing Abraham, as it says in in the second verse of Genesis 22. So really to look. I thought that the most responsible course was to look for the reason previously, to look at the texts that preceded it, and that was I had I thought that the most interesting commentaries, rabbinic commentaries, actually did that. They looked at the previous stories and interpreted it within the context of the previous stories. Now, I don't think that they got it right, but that was where that was my thinking on that matter. So I'm going to give an opportunity for questions. Does anybody have any questions so far? Okay, you could, yes, Martin?
Sorry, I had to unmute. Thank you for this presentation and a great introduction. One of the questions, and I don't want to kind of get ahead of you here, one of the questions for people working on this issue, and those of us who are, long time sort of pioneers in this question of circumcision in Judaism, is what exactly is going on with the early authors of the Pentateuch. And we have seen things about the book of J, a couple of iterations in between, then the book of P, presumably the Hebrew priests. Some people say that the book of J was written by a woman, but what I have heard, and I don't have any way to verify it, is that the original version, the book of P, had no mention of circumcision, and it had Genesis 15 with this story about Abraham and a covenant, and then somewhere between there and the book of P, Genesis 17 appears that seems to restate a lot of the things from 2 earlier, and then introduces circumcision. So how does that happen? You were talking about layering.
Yeah, definitely, Martin. And I'm going to be talking specifically about this in the last part of my talk, about how what was the relationship of the biblical sources to circumcision? Did everybody accept it? Was it widely prevalent? Was it an assumption that every Israelite was circumcised? These are questions that we have partial answers to, I think. And I don't think that, just to give you a hint of this now, I don't think that circumcision was the law of the land, as it wthe in the biblical period. I think that it was a custom, and I think it was a custom, but the question is how widespread. And I think that that's debatable, but it was really emphasized by later authors rather than earlier authors. So, in terms of authenticity, from that perspective, I don't hold a lot of truck with with the notion of authenticity, but in terms of authenticity, it's a later part of biblical text. So for me, I just wanted to clarify. For me, the original story is not P, it's E, what I call the Elohistic source. It's the source that uses the word Elohim, the name Elohim for God. P is I think a later. It comes after J, and so there's for me the order of sources is E, then J, then P, and they all build on each other. So. But I really didn't want to bring that nomenclature in because I feel that that's the me being a jargony academic. So I didn't want to go with that immediately. Eva, did you have a question?
I do, and I hate to ask this question so early in this process. Hello, Tzemah.
Hi, Eva.
The question that you asked. Why did Abraham murder his son? Number one, I agree with you that he in fact did. I thought the question that would be asked by most who read the Torah is, did he? Because it says that, sure, he saw the voice said don't, and he didn't. And yet, in the very next sentence, it says, and Abraham returned to his parents. It didn't say, and Abraham and Isaac did. So he did nothing I don't think it has anything to do with circumcision. He did what people did in those days, and that is sacrifice their sons or their children to the gods. So I think that it's an old enough story that there was sacrifice of children at that time.
Sure.
We came to about why did he murder him?
Yeah. So Eva, I just want to be able to respond effectively. Was that a comment or just that a question? Because I don't exactly know how to respond. I agree with much of what you said. I was going to go into.
I'm curious about why you're asking why did he kill him?
Yeah. Well, I'm asking that because I think that in the original story he did kill him. Meaning, I do an analysis of, and I look at closely at from a philological perspective at chapter 22 in Genesis, and I come to the conclusion that the original story posited a murder over there rather than not, and. You brought you brought at least one of the reasons in your comment. You said that Abraham returned alone. Abraham returned alone to his servants, and then they went together to Beersheba. And Isaac is not mentioned in that fateful verse 19 in that chapter, and that is I think one of the primary reasons that the later rabbinic commentary expansions really, built off of that particular verse. But there are a few other reasons why I assume that is the that is the original story. One of the main ones is that Isaac is simply I don't see him mentioned ever again in that particular strand of biblical text, and that kind of indicates that he's gone. That there is no more Isaac, and so that for me is a powerful reason. But more, if you look, there's also I didn't want to go too much into like the nitty gritty of biblical philology, but in another place in the Revelation when. As Abraham has lifted his knife into the sky, it said, there's a revelation. Do not, in the original, in the text as we have it, do not do not bring down the knife, and do not do to your son anything. For now I know that you fear God, and that you do not withhold your son, your only son, from me. And that's what it says. But if you look closely at that verse, there's a, there's a discontinuity over there. You do not, the second half of the verse says, you do not withhold your son, your only son, from me, when in fact, he was just withheld, meaning, that statement caused him to be withheld. And if you look at that closely, that first part of the statement, if we go by the famous names of God criterion, which is the way people distinguish the authors, you see that revelation was from Yahweh, from Adonai, whereas the rest of the text is, the original story is from Elohim. And so that first part seems to have been tampered with. And really the revelation was, you did not withhold your son. Actually, you brought the knife down, and you did not withhold your son. You actually murdered him. And so, I think that is, that's in a nutshell most of the reasoning. There are other more subtle points, but for the most part, that's the line of my argument over there. But regardless, one point I want to make, regardless if whether you accept that he was murdered or not, whether you accept my reconstruction of the original story or not, the question still remains: why? Like the why did the God character of chapter 22 command Abraham to do that? It might be a less urgent moral question, but it is a moral ethical question nonetheless, in the context of that story. And that's where I really want to go. So are there other comments or questions before I reveal the why? Okay. So the why, actually, you have to go back, in my mind, 2 chapters to the beginning of the rather short Abraham stories in the original, what I've started to call the original Bible, so E's first version. And I'm just going to bring up, I'm sorry, I'm just going to share the screen. I'm just going to bring up a little, a little of my presentation in the actual book. So give me a second over here. Okay. So okay. So I'm just going to go do a little biblical text over here. This is an English, partially my own English translation, partially borrowed from other sources. So we're going back to chapter 20 in Genesis. Chapter 20, just let me give you the background in terms of where it is in the scheme of things. Abraham and Sarah are wandering around Canaan. They still don't have children. One child has been born, according to a previous story, that child Ishmael in chapter 16. But Abraham and Sarah still don't have children together, this is the place is the land of Canaan. So here we start off in chapter 20. Abraham traveled toward the land of the south and lived between Kadesh and Shur. He lived as a foreigner in Gerar. Okay, so these are places in ancient Israel. And this is the setting. He's wandering around. He lives as a foreigner, sojourner everywhere. And immediately he says about his wife, when he arrives, Abraham said about his wife, "She is my sister." And Avimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Avimelech in the dream of the night and said to him, "Behold, you are a dead man because of the man whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife." Okay, so just a few words about the English and the Hebrew over here. In the English, it says, Avimelech, king of the Gar, sent and took Sarah. I just want to talk about for a second about that verb in biblical Hebrew. The root is lakachat or vayikach, and when a man takes a wife, or takes a woman, it is sexually, almost exclusively. So what it implies over here in verse 2 is that Avimelech, the king, had sexual relations with the matriarch Sarah, and that it's not it's highly suggestive. It's not like necessary, but highly suggestive. And often biblical stories are highly suggestive and don't say things explicitly. And we have precedent over here in chapter 12. There was a similar story where it is even more suggestive, where Abraham presents Sarah as his sister to Pharaoh, and he again, she's taken by Pharaoh, and Abraham receives a lot of gifts for that taking. And there it is even more suggestive over, that there was sexual relations. And so, the response, the divine response is very swift. But God came to Avimelech in a dream of the night and said to him, "Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife." So seems it's very straightforward. But wait, no, it's not straightforward, because immediately in verse 4, that impression is mitigated. Now, Avimelech had not come near her. Here immediately it says, no, that didn't happen. There was no sexual relations. He said, "Lord, will you kill even a righteous nation? Didn't he tell me she is my sister? She herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands have I done this." And God said to him in the dream, "Yes, I know that in the integrity of your heart you have done this. I also withheld you from sinning against me. Therefore, I do not allow you to touch her." It's emphasized 3 times in the course of this dream story that they do not have sexual relations, and it's emphasized in other places as well. Okay, and you see over here that I use for those of you who notice fonts, you see here that I use a different font over here in verses 4, 5, and 6. And the reason I use a different font is I think that these verses were added on by a later author. And they were added on because for a very specific reason, for the reason that's emphasized over here again and again, that Avimelech did not have sexual relations with Sarah. And so the question is why did this author, this later author, feel it's so important to emphasize this again and again? And the reason is a very straightforward one. In chapter 21, immediately in the next chapter, the next story, Isaac is born. And so if Avimelech had sexual relations with Sarah, it would not be obvious who the father of Isaac is. It could be Abraham, or it could be Avimelech. And considering that Abraham and Sarah had not conceived for a very long time, the odds would kind of be stacked towards Avimelech had these verses not appeared. And the post-biblical expansions of the story are very cognizant of this possibility and have Isaac look exactly like Abraham. They say that he was a spit image of Abraham, so as to combat the rumors that Avimelech he was Avimelech's son. But in the story, as we have it, the original story, there seems to have been sexual relations between Avimelech and Sarah, and so that doubt is there in the original story. And so just like you can see just how the original dream story went. But God came to Avimelech in a dream here at the end of page 20. But God came to Avimelech in a dream of the night and said to him, "Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife." Now, therefore, restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. If you don't restore her, know for sure that you will die, and all who are yours. Okay, so so this kind of dream is one that instills fear in Avimelech. And just a couple words about fear in this particular strand of biblical storytelling. Fear of God is the overarching, the overriding commandment for this particular strand of biblical authorship. It is a more libertarian strand of biblical authorship. It doesn't have a lot of laws, but the fear of God is the overriding law or principle. And so in this story, Abraham did not fear God because he did not trust God to protect him in the context of residing in Gerar, and lied and presented Sarah as a sister. And then bad things happened to Sarah, and whereas the inhabitants of the place, they did fear. This dream caused them to fear. And Avimelech and his servants are very afraid, according to verse 8, as we have over here. Avimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told all these things in their ear. The men were very afraid. And so we have here Abraham, who's supposed to, who's known throughout the generations as the man of faith, not trusting God. And that this is going to have to be addressed. So just so you get the sense that even the biblical text was worried about the issue of paternity, I just want you to look at the beginning of chapter 21 in the book of Genesis. When Isaac is born, there is so much emphasis on paternity here. And I'm just going to read you a few of the verses, but it's emphasized throughout the chapter even more. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son who was born unto him, who Sarah bore him. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. 6 times in 3 verses, emphasizing paternity. The text was very, very concerned about this. There's no doubt of it. Okay, so now you might be able to guess where I am going with this now, because I've given you a lot of the background. But here, this is the reason I believe for the command in chapter 22 to sacrifice Isaac. It is to prove that Abraham does fear God, and the vehicle of that proof is the sin, is the product of his sin, is the possibly bastard son Isaac, and that is why Isaac is murdered by Abraham. It's a very, very bloody literary justice, does that make me does that make us happier about the story? Probably not, but it solves a particular literary problem. It doesn't solve a whole host of ethical problems around the story, but the particular literary issue of like why Abraham was commanded to sacrifice Isaac, and why, according to the original version, I believe he did so, is solved by this analysis. But other questions, many other questions remain. So I'm going to give a chance for some more questions. Sylvia?
Shalom. I'm not sure if this will be very productive as a question, but do you feel that in some sense your method of interpretation is relying on like a logical consistency in the narration? That might sound like a weird question. I can explain why I'm asking it if you want.
Yeah. Why don't you give me the background while you're asking why? I mean, it's based on a particular philological methodology, which has principles, and so I believe is coherent. But why don't you continue with your question?
So when I interpret texts, I'm sometimes interpreting them in a paraconsistent way, and that's also a jargon term. It means if it's a type of logic that is inconsistent, or when you can have paradoxes that have some type of meaningful content to be expressed. When I read the Torah, I'm often reading it from a paradoxical perspective, where I'm looking for these types of paradoxes. And so I don't know if that's inconsistent with your reading of it. I'm just wanting to maybe ask or point towards whether you are engaged in a consistent interpretation, and whether that's maybe incompatible with a paraconsistent or a paradoxical one.
Well, I'll try. I'm not sure I entirely understood you, but I'll try to relate to the parts that I did understand. So consistency is quite important to me. And, I believe that my theory is more consistent and coherent than alternative theories of biblical composition, which is why I accept it. But as any responsible philologist will admit, there is, biblical criticism. I feel there's a bit of an art to it, because you have to try to sometimes, fill in reasons and gaps, and a lot of questions remain. There, I think reading ancient texts and looking for paradoxes and inconsistencies is a very good way of looking at biblical texts in general, or ancient texts in general, just and how they contradict our assumptions of the world. It's over here, there's an accepted norm of killing children, and which is definitely, and we regard as entirely abhorrent, but was not entirely abhorrent in that day and age. And so reading it through the lens of all these paradoxes, I think, is a valuable lens to look at biblical text. Any other questions?
We have one question in the chat, which is the Abraham Abimelech rivalry and subsequent murder of Isaac sounds highly operatic, dramatic. Has there ever been a drama based on it?
There have been plenty of literary retellings of this story, and it's a trope that we just find in literature consistently. Like, we find it in The Lord of the Rings, we find it in Harry Potter, we find it, much earlier in the story of the Passion of Jesus Christ. Meaning, it's very dramatic, and it's been used. Those dramatic moments have been used again and again and again. Throughout world literature, and they just clearly strike a deep chord, and that's why I quoted, like, the works that many of us know. I can, if you think about it a bit, you can see the tropes of Isaac, Abraham and Isaac in those stories. But yeah, just recently, just before Thanksgiving, somebody wrote a musical composition based on my reading of this text, a modern cantata, and
wow.
and presented it at a church, and so you're always surprised at where a Bible critic doesn't really expect their work to take them there, but in this case, yeah, it was dramatized. My own particular work was dramatized, so I was very touched by that. Yeah. Any other questions?
We have another question in the chat, which is from Martin again. It sounds like you're presenting that Abraham killed Isaac when he was a boy, but Judaism holds that Isaac grew into a man and is the one through whom Abraham's bloodline became the Hebrew people. From the Bible, we know that Ishmael grew into adulthood and that after Sarah's death, Abraham remarried and had 6 more sons. So how does this fit with the idea that Jews are Isaac's descendants?
Very. I think there are like 5 or 6 questions there, but I'll try to relate to each of them. Yes, the story presents Isaac as being as a boy, although rabbinic retellings would have him be 37 years old, which is entirely unlikely. So it's really uh, in this original, you have to look at the original story as a whole, meaning not just this part of it. And so when people ask, like, where, a question I get often is, where did Jacob come from if Isaac was murdered? And the glib answer that I give is Isaac came from Beersheba, meaning he came from the story. A story has to start somewhere, and the story of the founding of the people of Israel starts with the journey with Jacob's journey, rather than with Abraham. Abraham is seen as a model of some sort of model of faith, as important as we might think that right now. But the story of the Israelites starts with Jacob, and many stories start with just the founding father. You always can ask, who came before, what came before, but it's, you could ask that for anything until you get to the very start, to the creation of the world or to the Big Bang. So that's always a question that you can explore further. And part of the impetus for writing later expansions of the story was to answer those whys. How is the story more connected? How are Abraham and Jacob actually connected? Okay, so we'll revive Isaac and create a coherent narrative of 3 patriarchs. And so there was, why did Abraham? Yes, there are versions where much later versions where Abraham has even more children. Through Torah. And how does that fit into it? There isn't only one story here. There was an original story that was added on to, and so Abraham, according to a later version of the story, had 8 children, right? He didn't have just 2. So yes. Any other?
Okay. Well, there's another question in the chat, but I just want people to be aware it's a little after 6, so I was thinking maybe you could finish your presentation and then.
Yeah, let me finish. I want to segue to circumcision.
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Okay. This is one of the issues that brings us here, and people have talked about this before, but it's worth mentioning again. One of the ways in which circumcision is viewed is ritual decapitation, so a kind of symbolic sacrifice. And this is not new. This is, if you look at historian people who study religion in that way, but it's just worthwhile to see how explicit it is in biblical and rabbinic texts. And so if you look at rabbinic texts, for example, genitalia, male genitalia and female genitalia is talked about in terms of face. It talks about and so like the head, the face, and so the penis is compared to the head. And so when you cut off a part of the penis, from especially from the head, you're engaging in ritual decapitation. And so it's fairly. I think the connection is fairly obvious. If you look at the stories around circumcision in the biblical text in general, if you look at them, there are a fair number of them associated with death. Meaning, it's just not just circumcision, like the gruesome story of the bridal price for Saul's daughter, 100 foreskins or 200 foreskins, and clearly they were not taken off of live bodies. It was that's also, instead of bringing the heads, it's bringing the foreskins over there. And then the other story we just had this on the website just a while ago about in Exodus chapter 4, where one of Moses' sons is not circumcised, and then he's about to be killed, and the way he's not killed is by circumcising him, and so again, there's that element of circumcision comes in lieu of sacrifice, and so it's just very clear. And so just a little bit about another few words about child sacrifice in ancient Israel. So child sacrifice clearly exists, and there were some very deeply held objections to child sacrifice in ancient Israel. Both positions existed. And we have a few stories of child sacrifice. The story that I was telling, also the story of the daughter of Jephthah, Yiftach, and the story of Mesha, the king of Moab, who killed his son on the walls in order to protect himself. And so killing, according to the prophet Micah, killing your firstborn son is the ultimate sacrifice. It's the seen as as a very effective, which may, from the emotional perspective, makes quite a bit of sense, as gruesome as we think, as we conceive of it. And so, and there are even indications that in Exodus chapter 22 that there is, you can read part of that, there's a law in Exodus 22 that is somewhat ambiguous, but it can be read as a command to sacrifice your firstborn on the 8th day. And I'm going to go, and that's where I'm going to take us now to circumcision. So when you have a text like Genesis 22, which is a very difficult text, difficult in the original version and difficult in its retelling afterwards. Difficult if in today's Bible, where Isaac is saved, and the question is how do biblical authors relate to it? And so the first way that it's related to is within chapter 22 itself. It's within where Isaac is actually saved by the later Yahwistic author, and in order to create the chain, but also because perhaps he thought child sacrifice was important, or he was against it. That could also be part and parcel of it, not necessarily, but we may like to think so. But what did other authors think of this? So that's always a question, and here is where we enter speculation. And I really think that chapter 17 is the priestly way. Chapter 17 was written by a priestly author. Is the priestly way of dealing with the sacrifice of Isaac, and so it's if you look at the story, there's very eerie mirrors. If you just from a literary perspective, there's the emphasis right away on the blessing of great progeny. That's emphasized straight out, and it's also emphasized in chapter 22. And there even the curious detail. There are 12 sons of Ishmael that are mentioned at the end of chapter 17 in Genesis, and then there are the 12 sons of Nahor that are mentioned afterwards in chapter 22, meaning the chapters echo each other. And so I do think this is, priestly source was very disturbed by the plague of the firstborn, for example. And so he advocated in a number of places to the process of redeeming the firstborn, and that led later in history to the notion of Pidyon Haben, for the redemption of the firstborn, which is practiced in Jewish communities to this very day. My parents redeemed me. I'm a firstborn. They decided to give money to the public library instead of to a priest. because they don't believe in priesthood. But I was redeemed, based on that tradition, and it comes because like they deserved to die, and so because they were supposed to be killed with the other firstborn of the Egyptians. It says this explicitly, and and thus to be as a sign of divine benevolence, that they should be redeemed again and again throughout the generations. And so I think that chapter 17, and this is where it's speculative, but it's fun to, or at least interesting to think of these ideas. In a way, chapter 17 is doing that as well. He says this is the way you could fear God. This is the way you fear God. You do ritual decapitation, not outright murder, but ritual decapitation in every generation, and thus you enshrine this connection to this first and original story. And it's also, and he says, and this is way before this whole story. Isaac is not even born, but Isaac is mentioned in this story. Isaac is mentioned by name before he's even conceived. So it's really, it's kind of maintaining a connection with I believe with chapter 22. Now, as I said, I want to emphasize again, this is speculation, and it's part of the reason why I am a rabbi and not an academic, despite my PhDs, is because I like engaging in this type of speculation. I don't shy away from it. I think it's productive. It just, it's good to think about. Okay, so this is where I end, but please, I'm very happy to open it up for further discussion. I think
we have a few minutes. We've been going for an hour now, so maybe a few more minutes, and people can write their questions into the chat if they like.
So here, you write about the original Bible. Is there a source where I can find the original Bible? Yes, my book. And I have all of the what I regard as the original Torah written out as an addendum to each of the chapters in Why Abraham Murdered Isaac in that book. So that's an easy question to answer. Yes.
Quick question.
Leo?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation, and it's such a pleasure to have you here as a part of Bruchim officially. It's wonderful. So circumcision is a widely practiced rite in different cultures all over the world. But one of the things that makes it unique in the Jewish tradition and starting all the way back in these texts with the Israelites is that it's done to infants. And there's been some speculation by different scholars about where that came from. This seems to be a unique kind of Israelite and later Jewish practice. Shia Cohen basically says, we don't know. Leonard Glick has this interesting idea that it was a kind of priestly hazing ritual for the parents. And I guess what I'm wondering is where you fall on this. It's speculative, but you just told us that you like speculating. So
yeah, I like speculation. I like to play with ideas over here. But you can see that a lot of the circumcision referred to in Torah is adult circumcision. Lots of it. Like, yes, you have him, it says that Isaac was circumcised on the 8th day, but Abraham was circumcised when he was 99, Ishmael when he was 13, and the Israelites in Joshua are circumcised as adults when they get to the land of Israel, and and the Shechemites in chapter 34 are also circumcised as adults. So most of the circumcision actually is adult circumcision in Torah. So it's interesting to speculate on that that it was may have been an adult rite that was transferred to infants. I can buy that. It's not, I just don't know whether we can really find good evidence for it. I don't know what text we would look for. So yeah, but certainly.
Thanks. And just real quick, the word orla, sort of applying both to fruit trees and to foreskin, is there something there? People have speculated, and there's obviously midrashic stuff on this, but I'm wondering if there's more to it.
That's interesting. Like whether it, where the word comes from. Is it originally? Did it originally relate to foreskin, or did it come from agriculture and then was transported to foreskin? And I don't know. I think it seems to me like the directionality could very well be agriculture to circumcision, meaning because there it's like a general word for a fruit being not ready. There's a generality to it, and then there's a specificity to human circumcision. It's a very specific thing. With with agriculture is general, so I can buy that that idea that it came from agriculture originally, and then was specific to human beings afterwards. Again, like we can all we can do is really speculate on these matters. We don't have like good hard evidence on it.
Thank you.
No problem. Any further questions, Sylvia?
So if you can answer, what kind of where does this position us in asking ethical questions about circumcision?
Where does this position us? Well, I don't. I'm a humanist, so I don't really don't derive my ethics from the Hebrew Bible. But I would say that as a humanist, I look at the Bible to inform the way I discuss things, because I'm Jewish. And I look at it as to be inspired literarily. That's where I look at it, and you can see that there were regarding the question of say of sacrifice of children. If we take it back a step, there was deep disagreement in ancient Israel. It was seen as abhorrent by some, and some as the ultimate act of fearing God. And the question is I just think that people were thinking about these things, of these moral, ethical issues, very early on. I don't think that it's we're in the 21st century or really the pioneers on thinking about the ethics over here. I think people brought this out. I don't think we'll find a record of it, but I do think that that it's very fair to think that the biblical authors were also engaged in these moral, ethical struggles. Now, I don't think also, I promised that I would relate to whether I thought circumcision was very widespread in ancient Israel. And so I don't think that it was, meaning I think that it came specifically from priestly circles. And you can just see like the stories about it in Joshua is like, that the Israelites were not circumcised at a certain period in the desert. And just this idea, it seems like it's something that, was sometimes practiced. And it just appears, one of the principles that I like to apply is that when a law is emphasized again and again in a particular source, and it is circumcision is emphasized again and again in priestly writing, it's very likely that people were not observing it. It's just like we know that this is true regarding idols in ancient Israel. If you dig up Israel, you find many idols. And you also find in the Hebrew Bible many commandments do not bow down to idols. And so clearly people were bowing down to lots and lots of idols. And so I would say fairly clearly, circumcision was not, from my perspective, not really widely or very widely practiced. I don't think it was the standard thing to do. But again, that's like, piecing together evidence. I'm not going to, sign on the dotted line. I just think that it's more probable than not. Monica, you had a question?
Okay. Yeah, I put it in the chat too. So if Genesis 17 is the priestly version, where do you think chapter 22 came from?
So I think it was originally written by the Elohistic version. I think the E version is the first author of the Hebrew Bible, or of the Torah at least. Maybe not the Hebrew Bible, the Torah.
So does that mean you think 22 came earlier than 17?
Yeah. 22, I feel, is part of the originals. Most of 22 is part of the original story. Chapter 17 is quite a bit later in literary development.
Thank you.
No problem.
Well, I think we should wrap it up. It's been an absolutely fascinating presentation and discussion. Thank you so much, Rabbi Yoreh. We are thrilled to have you as our presenter today. And I just want to thank everybody for being here. This was a wonderful turnout, and please keep visiting our website, keep writing, and keep working with us.
And I also invite you, if you have questions that were not answered here, people think about things after the fact, you are welcome to contact me. You can contact me at my work email. I'll just put it here in the chat for everyone. Give me a second. So it's rabbi.tzemach. As you can see, I'm not a particularly titled person. Well,
2 PhDs and a rabbinical degree, I think is it's enough titles for me.
It's fairly ironic, but I'm not into titles. But my congregation forced me to adopt this as my email. So here it is: rabbi.tzemach@citycongregation.org.
Lovely.
So if anybody wishes to engage me further or to ask any questions about this, you're always welcome to email me.